Carbs are often demonized, and honestly not without reason. It's the easiest to overeat, and it's also the easiest to process into hyperpalatable foods. And eating too much of it can lead to issues like type 2 diabetes or even worsened brain health. So there are benefits to some extent of cutting carbs, but there are also some reasons why it might not work for some people and why they might regret it. Today I'm sharing the top 7 reasons that people regret cutting carbs. Let's dive into it. My name's Autumn. I'm a certified clinical nutritionist with my master's in nutrition human performance, and today's video is sponsored by Element. More on them in a bit. Okay, there's quite a spectrum of cutting carbs, so let's first define our terms. You can be all the way at one end of the spectrum with literally 0 carbs. This would be something like a carnivore diet. You could be pretty low carb, like with a keto diet, and you're only having about 20 net grams of carbs per day. Or you could be somewhere in the middle where you're not necessarily low carb, but you're cutting out the processed and refined carbs. Those processed and refined carbs are things like flours and added sugars, which are going to add a lot of extra carbohydrates without the nutrient value. So simply cutting those out and replacing it with whole food ingredients really does bring down the carb count quite a bit. Or you could be somewhere between keto and just cutting out ultra processed carbs, which would be like removing all grains. Grains can come in a whole food option, but they also are going to be some of the highest carb options too, at least from whole food sources. So each of these different categories will result in a completely different type of impact that you'll get when you actually cut those carbs out. The lower carb you go, the more severe these impacts tend to be. And that first one is a blood sugar crash. Blood sugar crash is when literally our blood sugar level goes down. When our blood sugar crashes, it results in us feeling moody and hangry and really hungry. We also tend to have a very strong craving for carbs, especially quick digestible carbs like flour and sugar. Now, when you're used to eating a lot of carbs, especially ultra processed carbs, this is when you're going to get a lot of that up and down blood sugar level. It's a result of eating carbs, which breaks down into sugar that cause our blood sugar to rise and then quickly crash. So by reducing carbs, you're not really causing a blood sugar crash. Rather, it just doesn't cause it to re-spike. So initially just cutting carbs is going to cause this blood sugar crash, especially as the body adjusts. But assuming that you don't have any real blood sugar control issues, this blood sugar crash does tend to be short-lived, especially when you are actually replacing it with foods that help to stabilize blood sugar like protein, fat, and fiber. Okay, the second reason why someone might regret cutting carbs is lower athletic performance. Now, there's definitely some sports benefit when it comes to consuming carbohydrates, and that's because our muscles are the biggest storage for carbohydrates. We store carbs in the form of glycogen in our muscles, and we use it for fast, explosive type of sports. We need that stored glycogen for things like powerlifting or sprinting, things that require maximal effort in a very short amount of time. So those who are in these higher intensity sports probably will see a lower athletic performance if they do reduce carbohydrates, which is the case for those people to actually make sure that they're getting enough of even those higher glycemic load carbs. But on the flip side, endurance athletes actually don't require this as much. And yet they're the ones we most often associate with carb loading. Because endurance is lower intensity, we actually burn fat during that type of exercise a lot easier. It's also a more sustainable energy source with endurance training. When we switch to burning fat during endurance, it can also help to prevent the long dreaded bonking. There is an adaptation period, especially if you're used to carb loading, but ultimately for endurance athletes, reducing and replacing some of those carbs with higher quality fats might be a better option. Which, speaking of athletes, something else that is really important is making sure that your electrolytes are balanced, which is why I love today's sponsor, Element. Element is an amazing electrolyte company that was specifically created with intermittent fasting, lower carb eating, and athletes in mind. It actually contains the sodium, magnesium, and potassium to help replace lost electrolytes, all without having any sugar. And proper hydration isn't just drinking water, it's also making sure we have electrolytes too. I personally take anywhere between 1 to 2 elements per day, especially now that I'm breastfeeding, because I have to drink a lot more water. And the more water we drink, the more it can dilute out our electrolyte levels, which therefore increases our need for electrolytes even further. And Element is so tasty. Their grapefruit flavor is my absolute favorite. I was so happy when they finally put it into like their permanent rotation and no longer made it a limited release flavor. But Element also comes in a lot of other delicious flavors too, like the citrus, raspberry, and orange salt. And right now, Element is offering my viewers a free sample pack with any order. That's 8 single-serve packets free with any Element order. It's a really great way to test out all 8 flavors, so you can get yours at drinkelement.com/autumn. This is only available through my link, so make sure to check out DRINKLMNT.com/autumn. The link is also in the description down below. Okay, the third reason people regret cutting carbs is the keto flu, which isn't literally a flu, it's just a lot of flu-like symptoms. And not everybody experiences this, but it can happen for sure. It can result in like those muscle aches or feeling headachy, and typically this is going to be a result of not having enough water or electrolytes. When we cut out or greatly reduce carbs, it does cause a reduction in our storing hormone insulin. And when we reduce insulin, it causes our body to release a lot of water and sodium. So not only do we need to drink water anyway, but we need to drink even more and have even more electrolytes when we first are cutting out carbohydrates, which again is why I use Element. Okay, the fourth is constipation. Now, it's often thought that this is from a lack of fiber, but you actually get a lot of fiber from lower carbohydrate foods. So especially things like chia seeds and avocado or artichoke hearts and raspberries all are really, really high in fiber and very, very low in carbohydrates. So from my experience, it's actually not because of this. I've seen it's usually more likely from a lack of that water and hydration. Like I mentioned earlier, we lose a lot of water and sodium when we first initially are reducing carbohydrates, which can result in constipation as well. So assuming that that is addressed, that tends to not be an issue for most people. Okay, the fifth reason people regret cutting out carbs is they find it not to be sustainable. Now, this viewpoint is often taken depending on the level of carbohydrate restriction. Typically, if you're just cutting out ultra-processed carbs, that's actually super sustainable. You can make a lot of really delicious foods that replace those ultra-processed carbohydrates. Even cutting out grains in general can have a bit of a transition period, but ultimately, again, is really easy to replace and make different equivalent types of meals. It's as people get lower and lower, like more in the keto or carnivore range, that they find it not to be sustainable. And to this, I do agree. There are certain people that just need to be carnivore or need to use a keto diet because of certain health conditions. And for them, that is such a motivating factor. It is a lot easier to stick with what they're doing. But for people who are using it to lose weight, it tends to not be motivating enough. And therefore it tends to be too restrictive for their lifestyle. This is why I'm a big fan of not counting carbs, but instead of counting the quality. I've done a whole video on this. If you want to check that out, I'll have it linked right up here. Okay, the sixth reason people regret cutting carbs is that they're under eating. Carbs and starchy foods in general are really easy to overeat. And when it comes to weight loss goal, cutting these foods out or greatly reducing those foods makes it a lot easier to achieve and maintain that goal. Protein, fat, and fiber rich, lower glycemic load carbohydrates are just so filling. They're also so nutrient dense, it's really sustainable. But then there are people like athletes who do just simply need more food and get way too full on those protein, fat, and fibers alone to actually eat enough for their body's needs. And this is the case where having a little bit more of those carbohydrates can actually be helpful for stimulating appetite. Because just sticking to lower carb for that category of people doesn't really always make sense. Okay, the seventh reason why people will regret cutting out carbs is missing nutrients, or at least that's what's often cited, especially if you like Google search this. You'll see this in a lot of just general blog posts of people saying, oh, you're going to miss out on so many nutrients. This actually could not be further from the truth. Really carbohydrate rich foods like the starches actually are some of the more nutrient poor whole food ingredients. The most nutrient dense ingredients are actually the animal-based proteins. There was even a study that broke this down and analyzed all different foods and found that those that are from animal-based protein sources like milk and meat and lamb and eggs, those are actually the highest and the most important nutrients like vitamin A, iron, and zinc. But another one that's often cited is going to be fiber. And as I mentioned earlier, actually some of the highest fiber foods are also going to be inherently low in carbohydrates like chia seeds, basil seeds, artichoke hearts, and raspberries. Now, for all of these reasons, for my clients and for my community, I do not recommend counting carbs. It's not a useful tool and it doesn't actually help support most goals. However, there is something that I do recommend instead. So if you want to check that out, you can find it with this video right here. Also, if you're new to my channel and you love this science-backed information, make sure you subscribe right here. Come out new videos every Tuesday and Thursday. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in my next video.